So in order to talk about responses to Afropessimism, first we've got to be on the same page about the arguments that make up Afropessimism. Okay, so we'll do that. And part of what I'm going to do as I kind of go along is there are a number of kind of core components of Afropessimism that then for each of them, I'll discuss some of the kind of responses or kind of possible criticisms of this criticism. Okay, so like places that you would go look for additional research to help you respond to this argument. Just to get on the same page, how many of you have debated Afropessimism on either side before? Raise your hand. Okay, so some, not all. I'm probably going to spend a little bit more time on some of the intro then, in terms of like what is the argument. We're going to make sure that we get some common basis, common language for discussing this. Okay, so you probably know the name, kind of the originator of this particular version of Afropessimism, Frank Wilderson. And Wilderson makes the argument that civil society constitutively excludes whites. Fancy dark pen is normal. Okay, constitutively excludes blackness. So let's go over a few of these terms, okay? Because I think that this kind of statement is pretty important for understanding the rest of the argument. First, civil society. Anybody want to give me an attempt at a definition of civil society or why the term civil society is being used here? Have you heard that term before?
It's like a place with government rules.
A place with government rules, okay. I agree that there are, aspects of this that are connected to governance, but in most kind of accounts of what civil society is, the focus isn't on government. Anybody want to take a stab? No? Okay. And part of it is that for some of these critics of civil society, they may use it more expansively to discuss governance, laws, etc. Okay. In most liberal political accounts of politics, civil society is a set of institutions adjacent to the state. That is, they're public. Okay. They're not administered by the state. Okay, this is the political liberalism, which is one of the kind of dominant political theories in the United States, okay, or one of the dominant theories of the account of US politics, right? Liberalism tends to focus on individual autonomy, as in self-rule, okay? And so like individual, the autonomous individual is the focus of liberal political government, which also means that the liberal individual is a rights-bearing individual. Okay? So this set of institutions are important for liberal society because they are the place in which the liberal subject can exercise their will, okay? They can be part of public life without necessarily being part of the state administrative apparatus, okay? So you might think of churches as institutions of civil society, the bowling league, my like pickup basketball league, okay? The set of like political parties are civic institutions, right? Civic improvement societies, the Elks, like any of these kind of aspects of public life that aren't reducible to the state, but they are part of public life, right? That is, you're not participating in them solely by yourself or as a private citizen or in the realm of the home or the family. That is, They're institutions that are part of how we organize our public life, right? And they are intended to cultivate this kind of notion of individual autonomy. They're institutions of free association, right? You choose to be a part of them, they're voluntary. And a bunch of the language that I'm using here, okay, think about a number of the constitutional rights that you enjoy as the member of a liberal democratic state here in the United States, okay? What are some of the rights that are connected to this set of institutions or the things that I just described, where it's like they're voluntary associations, they're public, but they're not reducible to the state administrative apparatus? How many of you know your constitutional rights well enough to think about some of them that are connected here? Okay. Freedom of conscience, right? That is, this set of civic institutions isn't run by the state, so you're making individual and autonomous choices about the nature of the good life, right? So instead of the state or the kind of political administration saying, this is what the good life is, right? The idea is that you can voluntarily participate in a number of institutions that you might associate with your vision of the good life. Freedom of assembly, right? When I said political parties are civic institutions, right? The freedom of assembly is the ability to gather together in public, right? To form organizations and to exercise a number of kind of your choices or your visions for the world in those institutions. Yeah? Freedom of expression, freedom of speech, classic kind of constitutional rights that have a bearing on public life. That is, speech appears in public. It is a right to express yourself, to express your opinion, right? That comes back to some of this stuff as well, right? That you are, because you embody the kind of ideal of self-rule, you are making the case for how you ought to be governed, making some choices about that, okay? Rights bearing, that is, these are rights that are attached to your place in our society. Because they're constitutional rights, they're rights that you enjoy by being a member of our society, by being a citizen, right? Okay, so they're constitutional protections. One of the things that is characteristic of these liberal accounts is that most of our rights are negative rights. That is, they are freedom from interference. Okay. Notice when we discuss some of these things like assembly, expression, right? The set of rights that we were talking about here, they aren't necessarily guarantees that you enjoy a particular, like, it's not a right to employment, right? It's not a right to a certain level of income. It's not a right to be able to do particular things. It's the right to not have the state infringe upon some of the activities that you can participate in voluntarily. Does that make sense? The reason those are phrased as negative rather than positive is like their freedom from interference, the things that the state can't do to its citizens, as opposed to things that the state guarantees for its citizens to positively enjoy particular activities or claims on the government. Does that terminology make some sense? Okay. Now, so there we go, civil society. Constitutively, what does that word mean? Constitutively.
Like constantly? Maybe in a
Really close, right? So when you say constantly, you mean that it's a feature that's just like, it's going to be there no matter what, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was just like, it's like an intrinsic part of civil society.
Intrinsic, right? As in, it has to be there in order for the thing to be. Okay, that's what it means for something to have an intrinsic quality, right? If I'm intrinsically long-winded, that means that wherever I am, I'm going to be talking a lot. Okay, it's like a quality that can't change. Okay. Constitutively is related to a word that you definitely know because you were just talking about this kind of stuff. Constitution, okay, when we constitute a society, right, we're building the foundations or the guardrails. Think about the number of kind of building or constructive metaphors that go on when you use that kind of language, okay? So, right, the Constitution sets the boundaries on what anybody can do within that political body, right? Like in theory, the constitutional rights are, like Congress can't pass legislation that infringes on constitutional rights, right? That's why the court has the right of judicial review, yeah? So constitutively, think of that like the Constitution, as in at its foundation or at its core all the time, intrinsically, right? These are kind of the qualities that you want to associate with that word. So civil society must, it intrinsically excludes blackness. That's Wilderson's claim for Afropessimism, okay? As in order for our civil society to exist, there must be a position, blackness, that is excluded from it. Another way to phrase this is, in order to exist, must have the position, blackness, that is excluded. Wilderson's claim is based on the importance of slavery for the foundations of the modern world, okay? When he uses the term modern, okay, what we're thinking of here is this kind of notion of the liberal individual, right? The rights-bearing subject, the modern set of politics that are defined in the European context, typically by the transition from politics as being defined by religion, right? Politics and religion being one and the same, the church and the state being one and the same, to a situation in which liberal politics of tolerance moves us outside of the realm of politics and religion being the same to politics being an independent activity or an independent entity, okay? So this is the other phrase that you may hear: no slave, no world. As in order for the modern world to exist, okay, slavery had to be a part of its foundation. That's the claim being made here. That constitutively part means that exclusion can't be repaired. There is no possibility of changing the way in which civil society, our society, the modern world, depends upon the exclusion of blackness in this account. Okay? And that's where you get the pessimism part of this. Okay? Afro here refers to the way in which the slave trade is the, right, middle passage that is from Africa to the New World. I'm putting in quotes because there's problematic associations with New World, but that the middle passage that is the movement of Africans into slavery in the United States, when he uses the term blackness, part of the reason that he's using the term blackness is that rather than refer to this as, you know, the constitutive exclusion of African enslaved peoples, okay, or an equivalent term like that, okay, Wilderson is taking a position on slavery being defined as the condition of social death. Social death. Okay. This term, social death, slavery as social death, comes from a sociologist and historian named Orlando Patterson. His book, Slavery and Social Death, from 1982. Okay. Wilderson takes Patterson's argument about the defining conditions of slavery and applies it to the kind of concept of this, you know, no slave, no world. Patterson defines the condition of social death using three concepts. Let me know if you can't read it. One, natal alienation. Okay, what's natal? What does that mean? Or sorry, you're not Hillary. You're Caroline.
Is it like
It has to do with birth, right? So this is from the condition of at the moment of birth. Okay, we're just like that. There is no way of participating in the society of which you are potentially a part. Okay, that is from the moment of birth, you are alienated from that society. And natal alienation also means the inability to establish or trace inheritance or a family claim. Patterson is, investigating slavery across the world. Wilderson, we'll discuss in a second, I think, is distorting parts of Patterson's argument. But part of what Patterson is talking about here is that if you think about the number of different elements of most societies that have been structured typically by the notion of family or genealogy, right? What are some of the things that have been historically associated with family or genealogy in most human societies? Inheritance and property, right? That's a huge one. In order to, you're going to get something from your family. Your family establishes a genealogical tree of property, claims, stuff that they're passing down to you. What else? That's it. The family's just, you go home to your parents or your guardians and you're like, you're just you're property bearing 55-year-old people. Can't wait to inherit your stuff.
like affection?
Affection, or also, right, like one of the ways that you might think of that are the set of values or culture that is passed along oftentimes in family life, right? Not exclusively. We're making broad generalizations here. Patterson's book is an attempt to draw a kind of very broad historical account of slavery, okay? And if you think about that from the perspective of, cultural transmission, okay? One of the claims that's being made here in a debate about the nature of slavery is that in slave societies, according to Patterson, and certainly our society, according to Wilderson, right, that in this circumstance, if you think about a little bit more concretely, slavery in the United States, okay, the separation of slave families, right, the inability of establishing either paternity or family claim on the part of slaves in the United States, that's what this means here with natal alienation. There is also a kind of general stoppage of cultural transmission, okay? Part of this is then the transition from the identity African, although African here is too broad of a terminology, there are a lot of different identities that are being summarized or looped, kind of looped under the term African. I don't have enough time to totally go into that. To black or blackness. The phrase from Wilderson here is that, people, the Middle Passage takes people from Africa and turns them into black. So it's like, rather than they get on the slave ships as Africans, they come off the slave ships as black. 2, general dishonor, as in your society does not honor, cannot honor the position of the slave. There's no ability to kind of garner praise or memory or remembrance. One of the ways to concretize this maybe might be about debates for some of the monuments in monuments to the Confederacy in our society, right? That it's part of what's going on is a challenge over what our society remembers and who our society honors, right? If you think about that kind of set of debates about Confederate statues, you get a lot of Confederate generals, slave owners, etc. That from that perspective, it's not as though there's a place of public honor in most of those situations for people who were enslaved or who were enslaved. Okay. Gratuitous violence. That is, the violence to which the slave can be subjected is a distinct category. It is gratuitous insofar as it serves no rational purpose other than to maintain or establish the position of the slave as the one who can be violated over and over and over again. Okay. Want to talk about a couple of the strategic strengths of this position, or just like part of the reason that it has been, pretty significant in debate over the past decade. One, it is all encompassing. Okay, like there isn't really, there's the pessimism part, right? There is no change that is possible if civil society constitutively excludes Blackness. That means that we are living in a society that is incapable of changing its fundamental aspect, which is that it exposes Blackness to gratuitous violence. Okay. This is a sweeping claim, so it applies to a lot of stuff. Okay, like that, I don't know a better way to put that in debate strategic terms, right? It links to basically everything. Okay. If you think about the kind of strategic power that comes with that, it means that being well prepared, practiced, and kind of being able to explain this argument thoroughly puts you in a good position to cover a lot of other, like all possible strategic angles on the part of your opponent. Okay. Second, it deals very well with one of the core aspects of affirmative critical strategy, which is that it is essentially impossible to permute. You can't really go for a permutation versus this position, right? If the constitutively part is true there, then there's no like, oh, we make it a little bit better, or like do our thing and be incredibly pessimistic about all aspects of change in the United States. Like, nope, doesn't make a ton of sense, okay? So if you are accustomed to explaining a bunch of affirmative arguments or affirmative strategy around permutation, combination, right? Like we make it a little bit better, we agree with you a little bit, not too much, reformism, etc. Like all of the things that are kind of classically associated with permutation debating as part of affirmative strategy. This set of cards, this argument deals very, very well with that strategic concept. Do we see why that's the case? Right? The same principle of like, it links to basically everything is a reason also that a permutation is extremely difficult to win, because a permutation is ultimately a strategy that challenges the link, right? So pretty tough to try and win arguments about no link or changing a link based on a permutation, okay? That's another strategic kind of power to this argument, okay? I put in here this as well. I have a lot of objections to some of Wilderson's arguments in terms of like the precise way that he makes them. But I will say that another powerful part of this argument is that there is a lot of research to suggest that on the basic claim of slavery is important for understanding many or all aspects of US history, like I feel like he's on pretty solid ground there. The specific implementation or execution of some of these terms and arguments will get into some of the places where there are significant objections, like I'm not accepting this account wholesale, but challenging the premise that slavery has been important for the foundations of the United States, for the foundations of our political system, for the foundations of our world, really, right? I think that that claim is very difficult to challenge. Most of the historical evidence that I have read from a variety of different perspectives, not just a pessimist perspective, suggests that we would be in significant violation of historical responsibility if we don't treat slavery as very, very significant for the foundations of our modern world. Okay. So what are some of the objections, or where are some places that we can get at to challenge different portions of this argument? Right. And this is a fairly rapid summary, so there are some places that I'm not getting to that we'll see if we can maybe add them in Q&A or whatever. Okay, so I'm going to label the first category constitutive versus contingent, okay? When we went over this, right, constitutive, intrinsic, essential, foundational, right? All of those kind of like building metaphors, right, that we were using for constitutive and constitution. Try and give me some of the kind of terms that you would associate with contingent.
You could like change over time.
Okay, so it's possible, not necessary. Right? What else? Go on. Okay, so depends on other factors. Right? Yeah, for sure. Well, somebody else had their hand up. Well, yeah.
It was what Rich just said it's conditional, or like external factors.
Conditional, okay, so like conditional on other factors. That is, some things have to happen in order for that thing to be the case, right? Okay, good job. There are a variety of parts of this argument that we could characterize as we should treat these as contingent phenomena rather than constitutive phenomena. Okay, so a few of the, like, there are a large number of historians and sociologists who disagree with the essential or intrinsic part of this claim. Okay, that is, they can say, yes, slavery is foundational or very significant in the development of American society or American politics. Okay, but that's different than saying it is essential, unchanging, or intrinsic. Okay, that is, we need an account of historical study should include the recognition of contingency. That is, instead of a deterministic argument. Determinism, right, means we know something in advance. It is bound to happen in a particular way, is determined, right? It will occur in a particular way no matter what. See how that, right? Your definitions of contingency are not deterministic, okay? From this perspective, one of the things that is important to keep track of in our historical study is contingency. What could have been different or what could be different, okay? There are some important ways of thinking about the role of, for instance, race and slavery in the United States that emphasize aspects of contingency. Even so, like I said, if I'm debating this argument, I don't really want to take on trying to make the argument that like slavery or anti-blackness is unimportant for understanding our world. Just like, that's not a place in the debate that I want to be. I think that argument's very bad. Okay. So instead, we're trying to get at some of these arguments that don't try and like refute this in its entirety, right? They take on the part of it that's the like, part of it is taking on the pessimism component. We'll get to that in a second. But another way of thinking of this is like, how do we think about race? So this, like part of the phrasing here, that I should, the impact argument to this position is described as anti-blackness, okay? It is important to note here that anti-blackness in this terminology is distinct from how you might use the term racism in everyday conversation or an imprecise definition. You may have even seen people use the phrase anti-black racism. Most of those people are not discussing anti-blackness in the way that the pessimists are, okay? This anti-blackness component is tied to the notion that there is a position, slave, that is defined by blackness, and because it is constitutively excluded from civil society, that means that this set of impacts, including gratuitous violence, are visited on the category or the position blackness, okay? Here, you might want to think about some different ways of trying to explain the role of race in American history or in modern history. An important work in the sociology of race is the concept of racial formation. Okay, that is, this is Michael Omi and Howard Winnett. Okay, I think the original edition of Racial Formations is like 1994, but I don't remember it off the top of my head. I can email you some site stuff later if you're interested. Okay. To get into like, sorry, I skipped a step here. Race and politics, the pessimism part of this is like political change cannot touch anti-blackness. You're not capable of changing our politics in a way that repairs or remedies anti-blackness. Okay. A contingent understanding of this might say, well, repair, remedy, justice based on historical accountability is possible. That is, we can take what started out as a, kind of an element of the foundation, and it can be changed. Okay. And the racial formation theory says, in fact, that there are many aspects of the role of race in American politics that have changed. Okay. There are a few examples of this that are, that would be important to get into. I can, answer some questions about them. Like one of them is how the Irish became white. The book by Michael Ignatieff. Sorry, I also get his name confused sometimes with, there's Ignatieff spelled with a V and one Ignatieff spelled with an F. And I can't remember right now exactly which one's which, sorry. Okay. Reading some of the kind of history of race in America, you might be able to make a set of arguments about why repair, remedy, justice based on historical accountability is possible, and that race changes notice that's different than saying that things always get better, right? If pessimism says this is unchanging, okay, beating the argument only requires winning that changes have occurred, not that things have gotten better. Don't set the bar for yourself at, everything's getting better. Like US history is this just progressive story, right? Like granting of civil, it's like Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments, civil rights, Obama gets elected, everything's better, okay? Like you don't really want to tell that story in responding to this position, but you can tell a story that is about change that doesn't necessarily focus on improvement. So for instance, that the role or kind of the position that Blackness has in the US racial formation changes over time because it is not solely defined by slavery, but instead that these different formations require different tools. It is important to understand how race has changed in order to understand what we need to do to deal with racism differently. Okay. That is an example of this. Okay. How many of you have heard the terminology of colorblindness? Okay, Asha, give me a definition of colorblindness.
basically it's like you don't see race and that everybody's equal, but in doing so, you erase the culture of races.
Okay, so you're already using that term in a way that suggests that it's like, well, that's not where we want to get to, right? Okay. There are many people who might use that term more. I'm not suggesting this is our argument, but I want to just use this as an example. Okay. Like a number of conservative politicians, you know, they love to quote the part of MLK that's like, be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin, right? They're like, oh, I don't see it. I don't evaluate, you know, race in my position in the world, right? That can be used as a way to undermine accountability or change, right? The like, by not, this also happened in the, I would say, the Shelby County decision for the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court, where it's like the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of this like tautological statement for Roberts about just like, well, we're going to forget the idea that our history is informed by, you know, deep racism in our electoral process, and we're just going to say that like we got to get rid of any racial criteria for evaluating the fairness of our elections. Okay, colorblindness might have been a powerful tool during some portions of like in dealing with the aftermath of Plessy v. Ferguson, right? The notion of separate but equal. Colorblindness in that circumstance, not blindness per se, but the notion of formal equality might be a powerful tool in that circumstance. You might say, well, what is really important is to get people access to civil rights, get them access to vote, right? Access to voting power, access to the democratic tools of our society, right? And the current racial formation that is not based on necessarily separate but equal, but differential inclusion, okay? Colorblindness might be a tool that then becomes a potential powerful conservative tool as opposed to a radical one, okay? Do you see how that example is all intended to draw out the ways in which this claim, different racial formations require different tools? So like formal equality might be an important political argument in some circumstances, but in others, it might undermine your purpose of seeking justice or accountability, right? It depends. And this contingency argument is a way of getting at what we need to learn is the set of tools that are appropriate for the circumstance. Like it's not always going to work the same way across all time or across all moments in history. We can instead learn about those changes in history to understand which tools we want to deploy in which contexts, right? That undermines part of the pessimism component as well, in the sense that if any of those tools are usable, then we might have some hope for accountability, justice, etc. Okay. One of the kind of terminologies here, and I'll try and, as usual, for it covering. Over here. I want to get at for a second the notion of hegemony versus domination. Okay. You may have seen this term hegemony crop up in some of your debate research thus far. Where does it show up?
Like just like America, like exerts influence over like its feel like it gets to change the like practices.
Okay, so influence, right, and like essentially some version of leadership. Depending on your perspective about where that leader is taking you, you might say good or bad, right? But the term here, you've seen it in this like international relations context. It's also used in other political contexts to describe a relationship in which there is power plus some degree of consent or input. It's usually contrasted with the notion of domination, where it's like, think kind of 1984, like I'm stomping the boot on your face style, right? There's no room for and no participation of those who are being led in a particular direction. There's only coercion. Okay, there's only dominance. Yeah. Do we see how this matches fairly well with these conditions, right? gratuitous violence is characteristic of a relationship of dominance because there's no constraint and there's no input, right? A hegemonic relationship is one in which there is a power relationship or a power differential, but at the very least, like if you've ever heard any of you ever heard the phrase the velvet glove for the iron fist? Okay, you get the image though, right? It's like there, in addition to the power, there's got to be some degree of appeal or buy-in. Okay, the set of people who believe this racial formations argument are making a claim about how certain understandings of race become, quote, hegemonic. That is, they are highly prevalent. There's some degree of kind of buy-in, right? So for instance, you might say that some of you are learning a hegemonic account of American history in your, American history class or your AP history class, right? That earlier thing that I discussed about the progressive arc of US history, how many of you feel like you have learned at different times a version of US history that kind of does that? Raise your hand. Okay. Why is that?
Of the hegemony and how the US is perceived by Americans.
So, right, to some degree that's if you've also ever heard the phrase civic religion, right? That it's there's some degree of buy-in there. It helps if, the citizens of this country believe that the country is on a progressive march towards ever greater and greater things, right? It's it's a way of getting some degree of buy-in, okay? And that gets at some of this aspect of the ways in which these civil institutions work according to a logic of hegemony, right? When you show up at school, okay, I understand some of you may think of school as an environment where you're following a lot of rules, right? Whatever. But can we agree that it's not this, right? That's not what's happening, okay? You show up there, technically your attendance is not voluntary, right? Because there are truancy laws and all that kind of stuff. But right, same thing here, right? There's some degree of voluntary participation in the way that even though there is a power differential or power relationship in teaching between us, there is some degree of buy-in as well. Okay, so hegemony here doesn't have to mean it's not synonymous with bad, even for some of the people who are using the term critically. Okay, because this set of folks thinks that this implies a politics that is anti-hegemonic, as in what needs to be destroyed is power itself. That's part of the pessimism argument, is that, well, we can't really get rid of this set of powerful relationships. We can't get rid of power. Therefore, we cannot get rid of anti-blackness. Therefore, we must be pessimistic about it. What can be done is only to observe that it is impossible to change. Okay. Here, there are a set of people saying that we need a politics that is counter-hegemonic, as in, well, all degree of power avoids complete domination, and what's necessary is to build kind of a counter-hegemonic politics. How can you get people to buy into a different set of political relationships? Okay. This terminology matches with that kind of political option. Two other, I've got to rush through this, I'm sorry. Two other kind of major places that there are core objections to the pessimist argument. Okay. Slavery and labor. Okay. For a number of historians of slavery, you'll notice what's not in these criteria. Work. This is not slavery as defined by either work or the type of work that is being done. Okay. There are a large number of people who believe that Patterson's account, which is a global account of the history of slavery, kind of runs afoul of the way in which slavery has historically been conditioned by the need for or the employment of labor. Right. It's we are going to enslave people in order to make stuff, build stuff, do stuff. Right. And this set of people think that the frame of social death for understanding slavery, because it leaves out everything about labor, okay, eliminates solidarity. That is, the account that leaves labor out of the definition of slavery is another way of dividing people who otherwise might build a common identity on the basis of the fact that their labor is exploited. Okay, that we should see racialized labor. This is also a set of people who oftentimes discuss the phenomenon of racial capitalism. That we should see race and labor as so thoroughly intertwined in the United States that the important thing for seeking justice or accountability in terms of the historical record is building connections between different categories of coerced labor. Okay, so for instance, that we could see indentured labor, slave labor, and like one of the, it's a derogatory term, but it's used historically to describe the coolie labor system, that is the import of laborers from Asia into the United States and other, and also to British colonies in the Pacific. Okay, so like if you know anything about the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States, you probably are familiar with the fact that there are a huge number of East Asian laborers who are brought in to help build the Transcontinental Railroad, okay? And the contracts and labor relations between the railroad companies and those East Asian laborers are extremely coercive, right? They're not technically enslaved because slavery is technically illegal in the United States at the time, but their labor is definitively coerced in the set of promises that are made to them in order to have them immigrate or violated consistently by that set of companies. In that vision, you might say, if those things are on a continuum, that is like they're different from one another, but they are related, right? That kind of implies this counter-hegemonic politics based on or organized around labor. The coercion of labor, what needs to be stopped is exploitation, right? We shouldn't separate the category of anti-blackness from the category, we should think instead of anti-black racism as part of a tool of labor exploitation, okay? The people writing about racial capitalism or black Marxism, related terms, but not the same. Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson. That's his work, and then a lot of stuff that comes out of that. There are a number of people who write in the racial capitalism argument, but I'd go with Nikhil Paul Singh first. He's a professor at NYU. Okay. Kind of last category that I want to talk about a little bit here is the Atlantic paradigm. These are the authors that I'm going to have to look up rather than trying to remember them off the top of my head. There are a large number of people who criticize both Wilderson and Patterson's account as being too focused on the Middle Passage. That is, it is a reduction of the history of slavery to the phenomenon of the Middle Passage. That is, it defines global history basically in terms of Atlantic history. It's taken a regional historical concept and turned it into a global truth. Okay. The many criticisms of that are that it misunderstands a number of phenomena that are global. So like, for instance, the British colonial system, right? In some of those British colonies, slave labor is employed, in others it's not, but it's coerced labor still. There are some relationships to the labor frame argument here, okay? But these are all ways of basically turning the arguments about we need to understand our historical position and turning them into you are wrong about the understanding of that historical position. This is a counter criticism of your critique. Okay. Last thing that I'll say here before we start Q&A for just probably 5 minutes, sorry, is a lot of these arguments, okay, I think they're very good criticisms of Afropessimism, and in particular, if you're debating this year on, I expect there will be some critical affirmatives that are planless that discuss NATO as an anti-Black institution. This set of arguments is set up pretty well to be read as critiques of those arguments, okay? The thing I'm a little bit nervous about is these arguments as AF arguments on this topic, when you're defending security cooperation with NATO, like this set of folks is not, they're not like, yeah, NATO, US global leadership, it's great, right? They're generally kind of fellow critics on the left of the Afro-pessimist position. So it might be hard to make many of them compatible with parts of your affirmative. Depends a lot on what that affirmative is doing. But at the very least, like I think the amount of time that the kind of pessimist argument will show up on the AF side for people reading critical affirmatives, we need this set of arguments to kind of deal with that in a way that doesn't involve just trying to impact turn with NATO good every single time. Okay, so that's my big overview. Yeah.
Can you explain in like a couple of words what Black Marxism is?
So this is the set of arguments, like the terminology of racial capitalism is more recent. They're not the same. Black Marxism is an argument from Cedric Robinson that's like, Marx didn't understand the role of race in history and the role of race in labor, but essentially think of that as like, Robinson is trying to make the case that, yes, we ought to be Marxists, like we need to understand global history in terms of the role that capitalism and labor exploitation has played in global history, but that needs to be modified by an account of the way in which race, and in particular anti-Black racism, has played a role in the formation of capitalism from the beginning. Okay. That.
Yes, that makes sense.
So for 2A, our strategy, do you think it's best to like do what you described and like go all in on like ontologies like false and affirm, or do you think like defending like framework and everything would be an strategy also versus this kind of thing?
Well, part of this argument is designed to say essentially like saving our present world as it is saving a world that is constitutively anti-Black. And so it can be difficult to make some of the arguments about just like our impact is about existence, when this is an argument that says that our existence is founded on a fundamentally unethical relationship. So I think that some of those impact arguments always need to be supplemented with at least some of these arguments about contingency, a challenge to the kind of Sid was using the terminology of ontology, right? That if you think about that in terms of constitutive, somebody says that anti-Blackness is ontological. That's what they mean, that the categories of being in civil society are founded on the non-being that is being unrecognized as a being of Blackness. Thanks for reminding me to include that terminology. But that's where the when people use the terminology of ontology or anti-Blackness is ontological, think about it this way, as that's what I'm using the word constitutive there. Okay. As in, it can't change. It is part of the categories of what exists. Sid.
Okay, this is kind of like a weird question, but do you think non-Black debaters should be able to read Afropessimism? Because like my school has like a counter K if like a white debater says like Black people are socially inept. So I was wondering if it's like, do you think it's worth reading?
I mean, I think that there are arguments that have been made on both sides of that debate. I would not read the Afropessimist position from my position, but that's like I have seen people try to navigate that in a variety of ways. I don't have a definitive answer there, and I'm not sure that my definitive answer there is like that useful for if that makes sense. Like I've got the answer for myself. I've seen a number of different arguments about that, and I'm kind of where I am, but I'm not going to pretend that there's no way around that, or like that somebody can disagree with me fairly forcibly on that. Other questions?
Thank you.
Absolutely. Enjoy your next elective. You can feel free to email me for some sites or some things to clarify a couple of the things that you follow up on research here. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. You can also check out Dartmouth Wiki from the past couple of years for debating pessimism. There are a lot of those sites and docs in a bunch of our arguments. Like we've read all of these arguments for several years now.